Okay, I'm now going to ask Bill Roper to introduce our last speaker for the day.
Thank you, Chancellor. Good morning, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. William Fisher to you. One of the things you've heard repeatedly from the Chancellor and talked about yourselves is our desire to be a great global public research university. I would assert to you, if we're to be successful in that, we've got to have a great global public research medical school. And for that to happen, we need more physician scientists. That's a term you may have heard in the past. Let me explain it briefly this way. We need to have great teachers, we need to have great clinicians, we need to have great researchers, but there's a special class of people, that is folks who've gotten an MD degree and then gone on to distinction in research, that we call physician scientists. Rather than explain it further, I'm going to introduce you to one. Billy Fisher, a native of Chapel Hill, who did his medical degree here at our university, then went to Johns Hopkins for his residency in internal medicine and further training in pulmonary and critical care medicine. He came back here a little over 2 years ago and has already distinguished himself in a variety of ways. Major grant funding from the NIH, but a teaching award as the outstanding teacher of residents in internal medicine, and especially, as I hope you've seen on the national news, he's distinguished himself as a leader in global health focused on the Ebola problem. He'll tell you much more about that, but Billy is daily being called on by the CDC, the NIH, the World Health Organization, and he leaned over to me a moment ago and said, while sitting here, he got an email from the Department of Defense. They want his help in this area. And yesterday, he had an article published with a group of international colleagues in the nation's leading biomedical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, on Ebola and what's being done there. Ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to have our physician scientist leader, Dr. Billy Fisher.
Good morning. Thank you for that incredible introduction. And thank you for allowing me to present some of the work that I've been doing with Ebola to such a distinguished group. I would offer that none of this work would have been possible, though, without the truly unparalleled support by Dean Roper, Chancellor Folt, Myron Cohen, Marshall Runge, and Shannon Carson. I feel really fortunate to be at a place like UNC that has provided incredible leadership and mentorship. So in the short time that we have together, I'm going to try to present the current Ebola outbreak from the perspective of the front line, from where I was positioned in Gekadu, the original epicenter of the outbreak. And then what I'm going to do is highlight the role that UNC has played in really emerging as a leader on the local, national, and global level in the struggle to contain this devastating outbreak. So the outbreak can actually be traced back to December of 2013 to a small village called Miliandu, right in the district of Gekadu, which is the forest region of Guinea, where a 2-year-old little boy developed fever, some bloody diarrhea, and vomiting. He subsequently died 4 days after presentation of his illness, and unfortunately his sister then became sick with similar symptoms and died again 4 days after the onset of her illness due to Ebola. Their mother actually developed uncontrollable vaginal bleeding as she was 8 months pregnant at the time. Unfortunately, a village midwife took care of her, and in attempting to try to help control some of this uncontrollable bleeding, she developed fever symptoms and became infected with Ebola and was hospitalized in the larger health facility in this district in Gekadu, which is where I was located. She was then cared for by a healthcare professional at this hospital in Gekadu, who then became sick with fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and from that spread Ebola to Macenta, a neighboring village, to Conakry, the major city, the capital of Guinea, to Liberia, a neighboring nation, as well as Sierra Leone. So what began truly as a small outbreak in an isolated village in the forest region of Guinea has erupted into the world's most devastating epidemic of Ebola. This is no longer an outbreak. This is truly an epidemic that's affecting neighboring countries. We've seen unprecedented numbers of cases and deaths due to Ebola. As of September 18th, we have reported almost 6,000 suspect and confirmed cases of Ebola, with over 2,800 deaths due to this virus. And this is truly unprecedented, not just by the scale of cases and deaths, because actually that number is greater than all previous outbreaks in the 40 years since we've known about Ebola combined. But it's the first time we've actually seen Ebola in a major city with an international airport. It's the first time that we've seen Ebola cross international boundaries. And it's the first time that Ebola has actually an outbreak has occurred in a non-contiguous country due to an infected patient boarding a plane in an affected nation, arriving in an unaffected country, and spreading that to subsequently 21 people when a Liberian American traveled from Liberia to Nigeria. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of this slide and these numbers is the fact that we've known about this outbreak, this epidemic, for 6 months. And in fact, we can trace it back to 9 months. And in that time period, we've seen almost 6,000 infections, which I think everyone would argue is grossly underreported. The most alarming thing to me is that 50% of those 6,000 infections have occurred in the last 3 weeks, suggesting that not only is this epidemic showing no signs of slowing or stopping, in fact, it's heading in the opposite direction. It's actually progressing into an exponential growth phase. Part of the intrigue, I think, that surrounds Ebola is the fact that we have no idea where it comes from. We don't know how this 2-year-old became infected in December in Miliandu. Our best guess is that the natural reservoir for this virus actually resides in bats. And this comes from data, experimental data, suggesting that bats are one of the few species that can become infected with Ebola and not manifest any signs and not die from the infection. The virus is able to then travel from this natural reservoir to the human host, either directly through interaction with the natural reservoir or through intermediate species such as the African antelope, the duiker, or a non-human primate, chimpanzee or macaque. These animals will get infected with Ebola, will become extremely symptomatic and weak, and then they'll be easier to kill by hunters looking for bushmeat in the bush. And in butchering of these animals, they will subsequently become infected with the virus and then take it back to their villages, to their families, and if they seek medical care, to hospitals, where oftentimes Ebola undergoes an amplification and increased rates of transmission. After an incubation period of about 4 to 10 days, patients will develop really nonspecific symptoms, and this is one of the major obstacles in the control of Ebola, is that people present with fever, diarrhea, vomiting, the exact same symptoms that are common to more often seen ailments in sub-Saharan Africa, like typhoid fever and malaria. There are no pathognomonic features or classic features that can readily tell the provider that somebody has Ebola. So we often identify outbreaks of Ebola by clustering of deaths within a particular village or within a particular healthcare facility. So unfortunately, because these symptoms are nonspecific, by the time you recognize that Ebola is affecting your area, you've become exposed and oftentimes infected and died. Now, the hemorrhagic, and I apologize for the graphic nature of this picture, but the hemorrhagic complications that are often associated with Ebola as a viral hemorrhagic fever actually occur in a minority of patients. In my experience, we've seen it in about 30 to 40%. They typically present as bloody diarrhea, some bloody vomiting as well. However, blood loss is rarely sufficient on its own to account for the cause of death. So one of my goals is to try to demystify this virus here today. It's not the virus that we see portrayed in books like The Hot Zone and movies like Outbreak, where people are bleeding from every orifice of their body. We do see that, but it's in a minority of cases. Ebola, once it enters into the human population, is spread through direct contact, through broken skin, or unprotected mucous membranes, and body fluids of an infected patient. And really, every single body fluid is infected: sweat, urine, blood, diarrhea, vomiting, breast milk, semen, vaginal secretions. Everything we've looked at has actually had virus present in it. And so it's easy to see how people could readily become in contact with this virus. So I've got 2 young boys. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I can tell you that when they have diarrhea or when they have vomiting, I don't run into the phone booth and put on my Ty-Chem suit and double pairs of gloves and a hood and goggles and masks, right? I'm right there with them. And that's exactly what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa right now. It's a very family-centric culture. And people are getting infected not because they don't know what to do. It's because they're caring for loved ones. They're providing health care to their family members. And in doing that, they're becoming exposed. The difference between our culture here and theirs is the fact that if every bathroom we go to here, there's a bar of soap. Every bathroom here, we are in the Carolina Inn, so it's really nice bar soap, but every bathroom we're in here has running water, and I can tell you that that is not the case for sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a major reason why we're seeing ongoing transmission in these underserved areas. One of the good news is that patients, from the limited amount of data that we have, again, over the 40 years, we've only seen about 2,600 people prior to this outbreak, that patients seem to be only infectious when they're symptomatic, and their main means of transmission, again, is through their infected body fluids. So we can actually readily identify people who are potentially infectious. And fortunately, because this is a virus that's transmitted via direct contact, we can actually easily interrupt transmission with contact precautions. Unfortunately, once a patient becomes infected, however, we have no specific approved antiviral therapy or vaccine that we're able to use right now. So therapy is primarily supportive, and that basically means encouraging oral rehydration. Historically, healthcare workers have been reluctant to place IVs because of the closeness that procedure would require. Additionally, there's a huge stigma associated with placing IVs because of the fear of needle sticks. In the original outbreak described in 1976 by Peter Piot, they found that people who had been exposed to the virus through needle sticks had a much higher mortality rate than people who became infected through direct contact. And so that's kind of added a little bit of fuel to the fire as to why people are reluctant to place IVs. So I've described that this virus is really not as scary, hopefully it's not as scary as popular media has portrayed, and that we understand how this is transmitted, and we actually have really nice strategies on how to interrupt that transmission. So why are we still having an epic problem with this current epidemic? So one of the major reasons is really that we're talking about the most poor areas on the face of the earth. Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea are honestly some of the most resource-constrained environments that I've ever seen. And I've tried to make a career out of providing medical care in these environments. These are pictures of medical facilities, and unfortunately it's not portraying very well, but there are actually patients who are lying out in the walkway here. So there's an absolute inadequate healthcare infrastructure in these areas, and what I mean by that is we don't have enough beds to put infected patients. So people with Ebola, with this highly transmissible virus, are actually coming to these Ebola treatment units and are being turned away. And in that act, we are basically, it's a death sentence. They are not going to get any supportive care. And more importantly, they're actually returning to their village, to their families, where ongoing transmission can occur. You can also see that there's a complete inadequate hygiene. This is a patient who's vomited a couple of days ago. It's bloody vomit on the floor that has not been cleaned up. And so we have a complete lack of resources from an infrastructure standpoint in order to provide the care that is badly needed. Another major outbreak challenge is the fact that is the deficiency in healthcare workers. In addition to being some of the most poor countries on the face of the earth, they actually have one of the lowest ratios of healthcare providers to population on the face of the earth. So for Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, they have one physician for 10,000 people. So for a country like Liberia that has a population of 4 million people, that means they have 51 physicians. All right? And in this outbreak already, we've had over 300 healthcare worker infections and over 120 healthcare worker deaths. So that is not only draining the incredibly valuable healthcare resource that is incredibly rare in these countries already, but it's actually inhibiting our ability to recruit healthcare workers to go to this area. Additionally, a lot of these healthcare worker deaths, infections and deaths, and Ebola have an unfortunate history. Almost every epidemic we see a large number of healthcare workers becoming infected. What's typically seen is that they often get infected at the beginning of the epidemics before it's realized that Ebola is the etiologic agent. That's because they don't know how to protect themselves at that time. What's unusual about this outbreak is that we're seeing a huge increase in numbers of healthcare workers becoming infected in the middle of an outbreak. And we're not talking about inexperienced physicians. We're talking about leaders of people who spend their lives studying viral hemorrhagic fevers are becoming infected. And one of the major reasons is that in addition to inadequate healthcare infrastructure, we have a huge deficiency in material resources as well, including personal protective equipment. So this is me in Gekadu, Guinea, wearing my personal protective equipment. And so with this deficiency of this equipment, these physicians these healthcare workers have to really decide whether they should follow their call and provide care to their colleagues, their family members, their people. and without protection, or whether they say, I'm not going to provide this much needed care and wait for personal protection of equipment to arrive. So the deficiency of material resources in healthcare and human resources is a huge obstacle in this outbreak. Additionally, this is a picture of a group of villagers, a group of young men actually in Gekadu, Guinea, which is where I was stationed, who have blocked the road to our truck in an attempt to drive to a village to see if there are people who are sick who we could take back to the Ebola treatment unit. There's an incredible distrust among the people of this area and their government, as well as the people the government bring in to help them. And it's often portrayed in popular media as they just don't understand. They don't get it that we're trying to help them. But I would actually offer that this is absolutely rational thought on their part. If you look at the history of this region, it's devastating. This region has been wrapped in civil war for the past 20 years. The former head of Liberia, Charles Taylor, is on trial for crimes against humanity for his use of children as soldiers. The former heads of the RFU that really raged the civil war in Sierra Leone for the past 20 years are also on trial for crimes against humanity for their use of dismemberment and rape as tactics of war. So the people of this area really have no reason to trust their governments. And the only time that they see aggressive international aid is when there's an Ebola outbreak or cholera or meningococcus. So we're guilty by association either with the government or the virus. And so it's a tough challenge that we have to overcome. But it's one that is crucial to mediating the resolution of this outbreak. So I was trying not to paint a grim picture, believe it or not, but it's an unfortunate consequence of this topic matter. So now I've presented a lot of the challenges that are associated with this epidemic, and now what I want to do is highlight really how UNC has emerged as a leader on the global, the national, and the local level in this fight. So one is I was actually recruited to the World Health Organization due to the fact that I'm a critical care physician. I specialize in severe viral infections, and I speak French, and I have extensive experience working in resource-constrained environments. And so the idea was that they were going to send 2 teams into the field to see if, with subspecialty expertise, we could improve the care of patients with Ebola. And if we could do that, we could drive down mortality and improve relationships between the community and the healthcare facility. Gekadu was especially important because they have the highest rates of this entire epidemic. It's in the most austere environment that I've ever visited, let alone work in. So I was sent to Gekadu to try to lead this effort. And one of the things that I did upon arriving is really try to protocolize the care that's delivered to these patients. So contrary to history, I decided that everyone had to get an IV. So we implemented, everyone got IV, everyone got aggressive fluid resuscitation with bolus fluids. We changed our fluid dynamics a little bit. We gave empiric electrolyte replacement, and I had no labs to support what I was doing. So I was looking in a bucket of diarrhea, trying to decide how much potassium they had lost, and then trying to replace it. I was guessing, and I know at least one time that I got it wrong. In addition, we were trying to treat anything that was treatable. So we gave everyone empiric antibiotics, whether they had manifestations of a bacterial infection or not. We just went ahead and said, look, if they have any kind of infection, we may be able to treat them with antibiotics. And then we tested everybody for malaria, again, looking for any kind of co-infection that is potentially treatable. So with those 4 interventions, IVs, empiric electrolytes, empiric antibiotics, and testing for malaria, we were able to drive down our case fatality rate from about 74% to 50%. And colleagues in Conakry, the major city, were actually able to get their mortality rate to 43%. So again, suggesting that aggressive early critical care support can actually reduce the mortality rate associated with an almost uniformly fatal viral infection. On the national level, based off of my experience in Gekadu, I was recruited to the NIH to consult on how to prepare their hospital, and then just recently returned from Belgium and Atlanta, working with the CDC to develop a pre-deployment training course for healthcare workers headed to West Africa to provide medical assistance. And this was aimed at trying to overcome that one bottleneck of a deficiency in healthcare worker resource. And I'm happy to say that in 3 weeks we were able to mobilize this training course that's going on. Actually, our first iteration was this week, and we're now booked solid through the next 2 months. The training course really focuses on epidemiology of Ebola in this current epidemic and highlights the necessary principles of infection control, including, and most importantly, the rapid identification and safe triage of potentially infected patients, and how to take care of patients while keeping healthcare workers safe. We've also taught about the key features of Ebola treatment units that are in place in order to keep people, both patients and providers, safe, so that people can recognize when there's a deficiency in that Ebola treatment unit. And we've also stressed this changing paradigm of really supportive but aggressive critical care support in treatment of patients with Ebola. On a local level, we have such an incredible team at UNC, really headed by Mike Cohen, Bill Rutala, and David Williams, and David Weber, who have done a phenomenal job of really organizing a local effort to be able to be ready in case we see a patient with Ebola. And that starts with vigilance, raising the level of vigilance among all healthcare providers to be asking the questions about if they have epidemiologic links, have their patients recently traveled to affected countries. In addition, we've really implemented state-of-the-art infection control processes, including identifying rooms that will be used for suspect patients and identifying specific healthcare worker groups that will provide care if needed. We're the only institution that I've visited that actually have a separate entrance and exit and a structured protocol for getting dressed and undressed, which I think is absolutely the most important thing to the process of providing care and doing it safely. And I'm happy to say that the healthcare worker protection that they've put in place exceeds the current CDC and WHO recommendations. So I'm going to end with this slide. This slide was actually published about a month ago. And what this slide is showing is the anticipated growth of this Ebola outbreak. And so the most recent data comes from about September 18th, which puts us at about 7,000 cases. The currently reported cases are about 5,800, so we're not far off from the mark. What this graph doesn't show you is that by the end of, or what it also shows you is that by the end of September, we're expecting to see 10,000 new infections. And that by the end of December, we're talking about 200,000 infections, even doing what we're doing right now. I'm afraid that this epidemic has the real potential to become a generational event. So when you think about your life and you think about the world events that have shaped that life, whether it's the assassination of John F. Kennedy, whether it's the Challenger explosion, whether it's 9/11, I'm concerned that this Ebola epidemic has the potential to really become a generational event on the scale of these. And I have no doubt that this will absolutely change the face of sub-Saharan Africa if left unchecked. My only hope is that we look back on this day and we say that guy was crazy because it never reached those scales. And if we are able to do that, then we know that we've been able to act and to stop this epidemic before it gets even worse. Thank you so much for your time. I'll take any questions. That's right. It's a great point, and I think the natural tendency is to say, let's quarantine it, let's close the borders. And I'm here to tell you that that is not going to work. You can't close the borders between these countries. The borders are incredibly porous. So my answer is actually do the exact opposite. Instead of closing them down, go in. We have to mobilize an incredible task force to get in there now, to invest in this area. The only way that we're going to overcome community mistrust, the only way we're going to decrease spread is to actually invest in these people, invest in this area, and give them the best possible care. You know, I've never been, I've always had reservations about pushing for military involvement in humanitarian crisis just because of the complexity of that interaction. But I think the military is really one of the only groups that's going to be able to mobilize as quickly and efficiently of any organization. It certainly is not going to be an NGO. And I think that this is going to take a multinational effort. But I think we start by really going in there and putting up a couple thousand beds in each country and then recruiting healthcare workers to staff those beds. This epidemic is doubling every 3 weeks. So if it takes us 3 weeks to build 2,000 beds, we're going to need 4,000 more. But I say we do the exact opposite of what people have done in the past, and say don't quarantine these people, but go in there full force and really invest in them. That's what's going on in the process right now. So the CDC has, you can pick up any newspaper today, tomorrow, yesterday, for the past 3 weeks, and hear, people criticizing the effort. And I just got back from 3 weeks in Atlanta, and I can tell you that no one took a day off. I mean, we were working 6 a.m. in the morning till, midnight at night to try to figure out how to do this. The CDC, the WHO, UNICEF, UNAIDS is actually deploying a massive amount of personal protective equipment to this area to overcome that first bottleneck I talked about. The U.S. military is entering the scene to help increase the level of facilities, but we're going to need more efforts. But yeah, we're in the process of doing that right now. So I'm going to take that in two parts. Where is most research going, and then what do I think is the most important research? So the most research right now is going into antivirals and vaccines. There is some good work being done into pathophysiology to try to understand how this virus is killing people so quickly. And I think antivirals and vaccines, if they work, could be a game changer in this epidemic, and that would be great. But I don't think it should occur at the expense of the things that we can do right now, and that's aggressive critical care support. I mean, IV fluids and checking potassium levels can have a dramatic effect on mortality right now with minimal investment, and we don't have those things right now. So I actually think that one of the things we have to do is be aggressive about getting those things in place, in addition to pushing the vaccines and antivirals.
One of the ways I first started learning about that was when I had the privilege to read some of your blog posts when you were there, and they were really moving. It was really, I felt privileged to read them. But I want to thank you, too, because I think you did a wonderful job today also putting the human face on it. I think that is often missing, and that was really powerful to know your direct experience about why this is spreading the way it is, what it's like to be people who love your children, taking care of them in the middle of this. So, again, not only are you over there doing that, you're also helping all of us understand the real human face of it. That's really an honor. Thank you.